September 1942. Stalag Luft, deep in German-occupied Poland, surrounded by pine forests and watchtowers. Flight Lieutenant James Cooper stands in the cold morning air during roll call. His RAF uniform hangs loose after months of prison rations. Guards pace between the rows of prisoners, rifles ready, eyes scanning for any sign of resistance. Cooper's hand moves to his tunic. His fingers brush against a button, an ordinary uniform button, brown, unremarkable, identical to thousands of others sewn onto British service uniforms across every theatre of war. He doesn't look down, doesn't draw attention. The guards notice nothing. That button contains more tools than most men carry in their pockets. Hidden inside its compressed layers are saws, compasses, maps printed on silk, and files sharp enough to cut through iron bars. Everything an escaped prisoner needs to cross hundreds of miles of hostile territory back to Allied lines. The button that could free Cooper looked like every other fastener on his uniform. It had no visible seams, no suspicious weight, no telltale sounds when handled. German guards could hold it, examine it, even unfasten and refasten it during searches, and discover nothing. It was, by the standards of POW camp security, the most invisible escape tool ever created. It was also the tiniest weapon in Britain's arsenal against the Reich. These were Mi-9 escape and evasion devices, and they turned German prison camps into sieves. Thousands of British servicemen wore them. Guards searched for them daily and found nothing. The Germans knew these devices existed, issued warnings about them, published identification guides, and still couldn't stop them. By 1943, German camp commandants faced an impossible task. Every Allied prisoner arriving at their gates potentially carried an entire escape kit hidden in plain sight. The buttons on their tunics, the heels of their boots, the lining of their caps. All of it could be contraband, and none of it looked suspicious. British intelligence transformed ordinary uniform items into sophisticated survival equipment. They created compasses smaller than collar studs, maps that folded into spaces thinner than cardboard, saws that German metal detectors couldn't find, files disguised as shoelaces, currency hidden in chess pieces, radio components scattered across a dozen innocent objects that only worked when assembled. The scale of this operation remained classified for decades. Mi-9, the secret department responsible, operated from hiding spots across London. They recruited magicians, forgers, tailors, and engineers. They mass-produced deception. Factories that normally made boots and uniforms now concealed entire workshops dedicated to hollowing out heels and sewing maps into jacket linings. Every item passed rigorous testing. Could a German guard detect it by touch, by weight, by sound? If the answer was yes to any question, the design went back for revision. Only perfect deception earned approval for production. Only invisible tools reached the prisoners who needed them. The impact was extraordinary. Escape attempts from German POW camps increased dramatically after 1941. The famous Great Escape from Stalag Luft involved 76 men crawling through tunnels. Many carried Mi-9 equipment. The wooden horse escape succeeded partly because the 3 men who made it to safety navigated using concealed compasses and maps. Colditz, supposedly escape-proof, saw repeated attempts by prisoners equipped with hidden tools. German intelligence knew about Mi-9. They captured examples. They published detailed warnings. Camp commandants ordered additional searches, implemented new protocols, trained guards to look for specific items. Nothing worked. The devices were too well made, too cleverly disguised, too numerous to catch them all. For every button discovered, 10 more passed through undetected. This was the invisible war fought inside every German POW camp. Guards versus buttons, searches versus deception, German security protocols versus British engineering ingenuity. And the British were winning with devices so small, so ordinary, so perfectly camouflaged that holding the evidence meant nothing without knowing exactly where to look. The problem facing British intelligence in 1939 was a paradox wrapped in inevitability. Britain was about to fight a war across Europe, North Africa, and eventually Asia. Thousands of airmen, soldiers, and commandos would operate behind enemy lines or over hostile territory. Many would be shot down, captured, or stranded. This wasn't pessimism, it was mathematics. The longer the war lasted, the more men would end up in German custody. Winston Churchill understood this reality when he authorized the creation of a secret department whose entire purpose was planning for failure. Not preventing capture, but exploiting it, turning every imprisoned British serviceman into a potential escapee who could tie down German resources, gather intelligence, and perhaps make it home. In late 1939, Britain faced three interconnected challenges. First, the Geneva Convention guaranteed that captured servicemen would be held in camps, not executed. This created a unique opportunity. Prisoners were assets, not casualties, if they could be equipped to escape. Second, occupied Europe was becoming a maze of enemy territory stretching from Norway to Greece, from the Atlantic to Poland. Any escapee needed navigation tools, maps, local currency, and survival equipment to cross hundreds of miles back to neutral or Allied territory. Third, German security procedures were thorough. Prisoners were searched upon capture, searched entering camps, searched during random inspections, and searched again if attempting escape. Hiding traditional escape tools was nearly impossible, but there was one critical gap: German guards expected to find weapons, maps, and tools that looked like weapons, maps, and tools. When a British airman was shot down over occupied France, his options were dismal. Running without equipment required luck, language skills, and local help that might never come. Relying on the French resistance was gambling on making contact with networks the Gestapo actively hunted. Surrendering immediately meant reaching a POW camp with nothing but the clothes inspected and approved by German security. Many tried anyway. Some walked hundreds of miles guided only by the sun. Others froze in forests, starved in hiding, or were caught within days. The human cost was brutal. Men died of exposure 20 miles from safety because they couldn't navigate at night. Others were recaptured at border crossings because they lacked forged papers or appropriate currency. What was needed was equipment with 4 specific characteristics: small enough to hide in clothing or personal items, durable enough to survive crashes and rough handling, sophisticated enough to actually aid escape across occupied territory, and invisible enough to pass German security inspections, even when held directly in enemy hands. The scale of Britain's vulnerability became clear during the Battle of France. Between May and June 1940, the Luftwaffe and German ground forces captured thousands of British and Commonwealth troops. The evacuation at Dunkirk saved many, but thousands more remained trapped. RAF losses mounted as the air campaign intensified. Each downed bomber meant up to 7 airmen potentially captured. Each reconnaissance flight that failed to return meant trained specialists in German custody. The expanding air war over Europe guaranteed this would accelerate, not diminish. Fighter command and bomber command faced particularly acute risks. Fighters operated at extreme range, often over hostile territory where mechanical failure or combat damage meant bailing out behind enemy lines. Bomber crews flew night missions deep into Germany, where being shot down meant landing hundreds of miles from friendly territory, surrounded by civilians loyal to the Reich and security forces trained to capture them. These weren't occasional incidents. They were nightly occurrences. By 1941, hundreds of RAF personnel were entering the POW system monthly. Each one arrived searched, stripped of anything obviously useful, wearing only approved uniform items that guards had already inspected. German camp security evolved rapidly. Early procedures were basic: confiscate weapons, remove obvious contraband, search pockets and bags. But as escape attempts increased, so did countermeasures. Guards began checking the heels of boots for hollow spaces. They examined belt buckles for hidden compartments. They confiscated all maps, compasses, and civilian clothing. Some camps implemented metal detectors. Others used trained dogs to sniff for contraband. Commandants shared intelligence about British escape methods through official channels. The security net tightened constantly. Traditional smuggling methods failed against this scrutiny. Hiding a compass in a false, bottomed canteen worked until guards started checking canteens. Concealing maps in book bindings worked until guards banned unauthorized books. Sawing through bars worked until guards discovered the saw during routine cell inspections. Every successful method became a known method, and every known method became useless. The British needed something different, something unprecedented. The solution came from a newly created branch of British military intelligence designated MI9, operating from a requisitioned hotel in London. Room 900 at the Metropole Hotel near Northumberland Avenue served as the headquarters for what would become Britain's most creative intelligence operation. The department officially formed in December 1939 under the Directorate of Military Intelligence, tasked with two primary missions: facilitating escapes from enemy custody and organizing evasion networks for personnel stranded behind enemy lines. The location offered no particular strategic advantage beyond anonymity. A nondescript hotel room drew less attention than purpose-built military facilities, and the work required absolute secrecy. Under Brigadier Norman Crockett, a First World War veteran with experience in unconventional warfare, MI9 became Britain's centre for escape technology development. Crockett understood that prisoners represented untapped military assets. Every serviceman who escaped forced Germany to divert guards, police, and military units to recapture him. During the war, MI9 operations distributed equipment to thousands of personnel across all theatres. They supplied evasion kits to aircrews flying over Europe, concealed tools to captured servicemen through seemingly innocent care packages, and coordinated with escape networks from Norway to Italy. But among its most ingenious products was the uniform button escape kit. The lead designers were Charles Fraser, Smith, and Christopher Clayton Hutton, two men whose pre-war careers gave no indication they would revolutionize covert technology. Fraser, Smith had worked in missionary supply and understood how to source unusual materials. Hutton had worked in the film industry and knew stagecraft, illusion, and misdirection. MI9 recruited them precisely because they thought differently than traditional military engineers. They approached problems not as weapons designers, but as illusionists whose audience included trained German security personnel holding physical evidence. The fundamental challenge broke into three critical components. First, creating hollow spaces inside objects too small to logically contain anything useful. A uniform button measured roughly 3/4 of an inch in diameter and perhaps 1/8 of an inch thick. Into this microscopic interior volume had to fit items functional enough to aid escape across hundreds of miles of occupied territory. Second, defeating multiple inspection methods simultaneously. German guards used visual inspection for seams, tactile inspection for weight distribution, auditory inspection for rattling sounds, and comparative inspection against known genuine articles. Any deviation meant discovery. Third, ensuring the hidden tools actually worked under field conditions when a prisoner's life depended on them functioning correctly in darkness, cold, and stress. To achieve invisibility, functionality, and durability, all three problems had to be solved simultaneously without compromising any requirement. The concealment breakthrough came through compressed layering. Traditional buttons were solid molded material. The innovation involved creating buttons from multiple ultra-thin layers pressed together, with specific layers left as controlled voids. Engineers developed compression techniques that created hollow chambers within the button structure without weakening exterior integrity. The layers were so precisely manufactured that the seam where the button opened remained invisible, even under close examination. The process involved molding the button in two halves with precisely machined interior recesses, inserting the concealed items, then fusing the halves using heat and pressure that created molecular bonding along the seam. Detection avoidance required weight matching and material selection that bordered on obsessive. A standard British uniform button weighed approximately 0.3 ounces. Adding a compass and map increased weight noticeably. MI9 solved this by manufacturing hollow buttons for all uniforms, not just those containing escape tools. They coordinated with uniform manufacturers to transition all production to the new button design. Within months, every British service uniform used buttons with hollow interiors. Some contained escape equipment. Most were empty. German guards examining individual buttons found nothing suspicious because every button felt identical. The compass mechanism represented precision miniaturization at its finest. Traditional compasses required liquid suspension to dampen needle movement. Engineers eliminated the liquid entirely and used a jeweled bearing similar to precision watches. The needle balanced on a sapphire point with friction, so low it could rotate freely while remaining stable. Testing showed accuracy within 5 degrees, sufficient for navigation by landmarks rather than precise surveying. Maps used silk instead of paper because silk compressed to nearly nothing, produced no sound when folded, and survived moisture. The Bartholomew Company in Edinburgh created specialized escape maps that measured 6 inches square but folded to quarter-inch squares fitting inside button chambers. Saw blades used flexible hardened steel wire less than 1/16 inch wide that coiled inside chambers but could cut through quarter-inch iron bars in 20 minutes. Production evolved through 3 phases. Initial prototypes were handmade in small workshops, producing perhaps 50 buttons weekly. Industrial partners then manufactured components that Mi-9 technicians assembled in secure facilities, increasing output to several hundred weekly. The final method distributed assembly across multiple sites, with no single location knowing the complete system. One factory produced shells, another manufactured compasses, a third printed maps. By 1943, production reached thousands monthly. The button measured 0.75 inches in diameter and 0.125 inches thick. Weight was 0.3 ounces, including all concealed items. Most versions contained 1 compass, 1 silk map section, and 1 saw wire. The button looked aggressively ordinary. Brown vulcanized fiber, 4-thread holes, slightly domed surface, matte finish, identical to millions produced since the previous century. That ordinariness was the most sophisticated element of its design. Production began in early 1941, following successful field testing with Mi-9 operatives and early escape network contacts. The exact numbers remain classified even today, but estimates based on declassified manufacturing records and post-war interviews suggest between 15,000 and 25,000 button escape kits were manufactured during the war years. This uncertainty exists not from poor record keeping but from deliberate compartmentalization. Mi-9 destroyed sensitive documents before war's end to protect methods that remained useful during the Cold War. Manufacturing was distributed across facilities that kept separate records, and many of those records were intentionally incomplete to maintain operational security. Production scale involved more than assembly numbers. Each button required silk maps, and Mi-9 commissioned approximately 50,000 silk map sections during the war covering different European regions. The silk production alone required tons of raw material diverted from parachute manufacturing, representing significant resource commitment for items whose success would remain forever difficult to measure. Distribution relied on multiple methods depending on operational circumstances. For aircrews, buttons were sewn directly onto uniforms before personnel deployed to operational squadrons. Bomber Command and Fighter Command units received priority, with Lancaster, Halifax, and Sterling bomber crews equipped first, followed by Spitfire and Hurricane fighter pilots flying long-range missions. By mid-1942, most RAF aircrews flying combat operations over Europe wore at least one button escape kit among the ordinary buttons on their tunics. For personnel already in captivity, distribution became more creative and considerably more risky. Mi-9 established systems using prisoner care packages sent through the Red Cross and humanitarian organizations. The packages appeared to contain innocuous items like games, books, cigarettes, and clothing. Hidden within were escape aids. A Monopoly board might contain real currency and silk maps beneath the game board's surface. Clothing items arrived with buttons already sewn on, and German guards inspecting packages saw only replacement uniforms for prisoners whose original clothing had worn out. Geographic distribution reached Poland, Germany, Italy, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Stalag Luft held captured airmen in Poland. Kolditz and a flag IVC in Germany held British Commonwealth officers. Camps in Italy housed North Africa campaign prisoners. All became targets for Mi-9 distribution networks, operating through neutral countries and resistance contacts. In German-occupied Poland, prisoners at Stalag Luft used button compasses during multiple escape attempts. The camp saw over 100 documented escapes during the war. One account describes 2 RAF officers who reached the perimeter through a tunnel, then navigated over 40 miles through Polish forests using a button compass when cloud cover obscured stars. They moved northwest toward the Baltic coast, eventually reaching Sweden after 3 weeks of movement through occupied territory, aided by Polish civilians and guided by a device German guards had handled during inspections without detecting its purpose. The compass kept them oriented when all other navigation methods failed in unfamiliar territory at night. In France, resistance networks reported receiving escaped British servicemen carrying silk maps marked with MI9 identifying characteristics. The maps proved valuable because they showed not just geographic features, but also marked resistance contact points and safe routes towards Spain or Switzerland. In Italy before the September 1943 armistice, British prisoners used button escape kits during the confusion of Italy's surrender and subsequent German occupation. Several hundred prisoners escaped camps in northern Italy and moved south toward Allied lines, many carrying MI9 compasses and maps that survived the chaos when other equipment was lost. The psychological impact on German camp security was substantial. Camp commandants realized every new prisoner potentially carried an entire escape kit in plain sight. Guards received training to look specifically for hollow buttons and modified boot heels. Some camps replaced all prisoner uniforms with German, manufactured clothing to eliminate the threat entirely. Others conducted random button inspections, cutting buttons from uniforms and breaking them open. These measures consumed guard time and still failed to catch every device. If you're finding this deep dive into MI9's invisible war against German prison camps interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It helps the channel and means you won't miss the next one. Here is where the story becomes complicated. Despite 15 to 20, 5,000 buttons produced and distributed, documented records of specific button-aided escapes remain remarkably sparse. Very few personal accounts explicitly credit button compasses for successful escapes. This absence requires explanation. The devices were designed for deniability. A prisoner using a button compass would check his bearing privately, then discard the empty shell to eliminate evidence. If button escape kits worked as intended, successful users would be historically invisible. German escape aids for their personnel in Allied custody focused on larger items like hidden compasses in belt buckles, measured in inches rather than fractions of inches, designed for concealment in luggage rather than on the body during searches. American escape equipment emphasized pre-deployment issue of kits carried in pockets, accessible immediately after bailout but vulnerable to confiscation during capture. The British button, sewn permanently to uniforms and indistinguishable from ordinary fasteners, passed through searches undetected. In the specialized category of button, concealed escape tools, British MI9 devices were in a category entirely their own. German forces had nothing comparable. American forces adopted similar concepts later, but never achieved the same miniaturization or production scale. The button escape kit represented British engineering, applied to a uniquely British problems. Thousands of airmen flying nightly over hostile territory with near certainty of captures, and determination to give everyone a fighting chance to return home. The broader escape and evasion campaign achieved devastating results through combined methods across all theaters. MI9 operations facilitated the return of over 5,000 Allied personnel between 1940 and 1945, including airmen, commandos, and soldiers who evaded capture or escaped from POW camps. Approximately 5,000 escaped from German custody specifically, with uncounted thousands more evading initial capture using MI9 equipment and training. Operations around D-Day in June 1944 prevented the recapture of hundreds of evaders hiding in occupied France, returning trained personnel to combat units precisely when invasion forces needed every experienced soldier and pilot available. In occupied Poland, maintaining control over POW camps holding Allied airmen required what one German commandant called constant vigilance against an enemy we cannot see, tying down security personnel, administrative staff, and local police forces that might otherwise patrol partisan areas or reinforce frontline units. Whether button compasses contributed significantly to these specific numbers matters less than whether they contributed to the climate of uncertainty and resource strain that characterized German occupation. Every guard trained to inspect buttons was a guard not performing other duties. Every security protocol implemented to counter MI9 devices was time and resources diverted from containing actual escapes. The concept's influence extended beyond 1945. CIA historical reviews from the 1950s note that MI9 miniaturization techniques informed Cold War-era escape and evasion equipment issued to personnel operating behind the Iron Curtain. The button pioneered what became standard doctrine for covert equipment. Design hide tools inside items so ordinary that possessing them raises no suspicion. Distribute widely enough that discovering some devices doesn't compromise the entire program, and make detection so difficult that enemy security forces waste resources searching for threats they cannot reliably identify. Modern survival equipment concealed in belt buckles, hollowed boot heels, and modified clothing fasteners trace their lineage directly to room 900 at the Metropole Hotel, and the engineers who proved miniaturization could defeat security through perfect camouflage. Original examples exist today in the Imperial War Museum in London, the RAF Museum at Hendon, and private collections of military intelligence artifacts. Most remain sealed, still containing their original compasses and silk maps, preserved as evidence of ingenuity that prioritized invisibility over every other consideration. September 1942. Stalag Luft, surrounded by watchtowers, barbed wire, and guards trained to find exactly what Flight Lieutenant Cooper carried sewn to his tunic. British engineers created a device so invisible that its successes remain largely unrecorded in official histories, so effective that Germany implemented elaborate countermeasures despite having captured only a handful of actual examples from tens of thousands distributed. 15 to 20, 5,000 buttons manufactured, thousands distributed to resistance networks across occupied Europe. Unknown numbers used successfully by men who discarded the evidence and never reported what saved their lives, because survival mattered more than documentation. The button escape kit represents covert technology at its most sophisticated, a weapon measured not in casualties inflicted or targets destroyed, but in guards diverted, resources consumed, and prisoners who reached home when Germany expected them to remain captive, in men who navigated through hostile territory, guided by compasses small enough to hide in plain sight, in maps printed on silk that survived conditions that would destroy paper, folded into spaces measured in fractions of inches. British engineers solved a problem others had not even identified. They turned the mundane act of fastening a uniform into an opportunity for concealment. They transformed something German guards handled daily during inspections into a delivery system for equipment those same guards desperately wanted to find but couldn't. And they did it with devices so perfectly ordinary that even today, holding an example means nothing without knowing exactly where to press, how to open it, and what to look for inside. That was British ingenuity. That was MI9. And that was how tiny buttons helped make German prison camps useless, one invisible compass at a time, one discarded shell at a time, one escaped prisoner at a time who made it home, carrying secrets the Third Reich never discovered.